Hello, you've heard a lot of final statements, so I'm going to keep this relatively short and to the point. I was actually not here for most of the presentations of the jurors since I was had the unenviable task of drafting a short two-page draft statement of our preliminary findings. And I can tell you this is along the, I hope it's not a task along the lines of no good deed goes unpunished, since we have differing opinions, but they're all complementary. I think we all agree. And I'll just share with you a couple of the primary observations of this statement, because it's preliminary. It's just something to give to the press tomorrow. We hope to come out with more detailed individual statements, collective statements in the weeks to come. But I think the initial collective feeling and finding from these 4 days of presentations, and particularly by the communities of locally affected people affected both by these macroeconomic policies, poor farmers, and then people displaced by World Bank projects and so on, finance projects, is one of a moving and disturbing picture of real suffering. And dukkha, as one of our jurors said, real human suffering. And I, in my draft, wrote needless suffering and increased suffering, since due to the indirect and direct effects of many of these macroeconomic policies, reform policies which have been described, and also of individual investments which have needlessly and negligently displaced the poor, hurt the environment, and so on. And what emerges is a picture in India of two nations. You know, Benjamin Disraeli in the 19th century wrote, as England entered the Industrial Revolution, wrote a novel about two nations, how they, well, yes, the country was getting richer at an aggregate level, but how the majority of the population was actually becoming poorer and pushed into even a desperate situation. And that's what's been happening in India since 1991. Yes, there's been a great economic boom for the middle class and the rich. Yes, the country has high growth rates, but for the majority of the country's population in rural areas and the poor areas of the big cities, in many ways their quality of life has deteriorated. And of course the leading indicator, top of the iceberg, are farmer suicides. One statistic, because I quote this in the release. From 2001 to 2007, according to the Indian Minister of Agriculture, there have been 137,000 farmer suicides. And this has increased at a rapid rate, right, 20,000 a year. And you can bet that for every farmer that's driven by the general direction of things to take his life and leave his family, there must be 1,000, perhaps 10,000 rural people or people displaced from busties for urban projects or what have you, who feel that they're a greater despair or a greater fear about the deterioration of their already very fragile economic security. And of course, it's the World Bank and the Indian government that bear a responsibility for many of the policies and projects that have indirectly or indirectly caused this situation. I would finish in terms of what can be done. I guess it's fine to talk about another world is possible, have blanket indictments, but I think any change starts with a single practical step. It's not this whole event and what we've all learned, well, frankly, will be just another thing lost rather quickly in the endless stream of words and press and things that are written and said. The important thing, I think, if this is to have any meaning, would be a follow-up. One, if you want to you can't maybe change the World Bank entirely, but you can change the way you can begin to take steps to try to change the way the Indian government relates to the World Bank, and that starts kind of like a guerrilla fighter, to target against huge opposing forces, target the strategically vulnerable levers, where a lot of small forces concentrated can move a lot of things. And what you have is the Indian Finance Ministry has responsibility for India's participation in the World Bank. There's an Indian executive director of the World Bank who approves all these policies and projects, in fact cheers them on as much as anyone. So you might start by just an idea to throw out. Let's get the findings of this tribunal. Let's have perhaps follow up other tribunals and start sending all this stuff through the Parliament, through parliamentary questions, to the Indian Finance Ministry, to the Indian Executive Director of the World Bank, and put him in the hot seat, for example, in the press and so on. How is he what's India's position on the board of the World Bank to this evidence that we've heard? Because I think change always begins with tiny steps where people might say, oh, what's the use? If you look at the whole big picture, nothing can change and so on. But of course, it doesn't work that way. You begin with tiny steps to make a tiny thing happen, even a bureaucratic procedure that you use, and then it begins to aggregate. More people pay attention, and you have a sort of a self-organizing movement and change of perceptions. So that can happen, but it only happens by taking concrete steps in your own political system. I mean, that's my view, and of course in the political systems of other countries. I mean, we've heard how Mexico, for example, is affected. There's much of the same syndrome and so on. So I would leave that practical observation, and then again, I think what we've heard here is a story of needless suffering, even cruelty. Perhaps not intentional cruelty, but that's what's happening from the actions of the Indian government officials and the international financial institutions who are blinded by the narrowness and the arrogance of their own vision. Thank you.